Hello, you're listening to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. I'm Shaimond Foy, and today's special guest is Dr. Anica Zeyen. She is from the UK and she is a researcher, and she also has CBS herself, so it will be very interesting to hear what she has to say. So how are you doing today, doctor?
I'm doing very well. It's very sunny over here today.
Oh, that's great. It's very sunny over here too. And I know, at least they say that you get a lot of cloudy days out there. So hopefully you enjoy that sunshine the rest of the day.
I absolutely will.
So can you tell me a little bit about your eye condition to start off?
Absolutely. So I have what is called cone rod dystrophy, which is one of many conditions linked to the macula, so the retina in our eyes. It's a degenerative condition and it's progressive. I've had it since I was an infant, most likely. Nobody really knows because it's usually a condition that is linked to age. And there's a juvenile version, but that usually starts on puberty. So I got it very early. I cannot remember a time before I was visually impaired, but I can remember the times when my eyesight was a lot better than it is now. So as a kid, I could still read with magnifying glasses and so forth. And I would say probably about 10, 12 years ago, somewhere around there, I hit the mark. Well, over in the UK, we call it registered blind. I know in the US it's called legally blind, but that's when I hit that milestone. And since then, I've lost more sight. I have no central vision and some peripheral vision that's left, but I can see colors, which I really still enjoy.
Can you tell me a little bit about where you are now? Because you mentioned that you actually have CBS. When did you first start noticing the symptoms of your own CBS?
That was really an odd discovery. I think for quite a while I had CBS and I didn't realize it at all. I just thought some of it was normal because I see some of the hallucinations constantly. They're always there. So for me, I never questioned those. And only when I started talking to people and actually my husband too, only when I started talking to my husband about some stuff and then to others, I realized that not everybody sees those things constantly. And then I have the more typical sort of random hallucinations, but all of them are very real. They all look very real, like lantern posts and walls and so forth. And again, that took me a while to realize that this was something. So I think it took me about, I can't really say anymore. I would say probably about 5, 6 years before I fully got. And then CBS became more known and I could read about it. And at some point, while just reading a bunch of research papers, oh, this sounds very much like me. I know this. And yes, this is what this is. But as it started off with those constant ones, and I really can't quite recall when they started. I've tried really hard for many years to figure out when I started seeing those kind of, I call them fireworks and glowworms. They're always there and they're moving around and doing things. Yeah, and only once those random ones came in, that's when I started questioning it a bit more. So it was a very interesting journey into understanding what it is, realizing what it is, and then finding out about others who have similar conditions.
Did you tell your husband right away or did you wait a little while?
I didn't originally, but not for any reason except me thinking that it was just normal, that everyone constantly sees fireworks and glowworms. And because I've even seen those when I was a teenager and then going into adulthood, it just became more frequent the more of my sight I lost. But again, I just thought that everyone sees this is just something really annoying. And I don't know, at some point I started talking about it and he's like, no, not everyone sees fireworks and glowworms constantly. And that's how it started. And then I started saying sometimes for instance, I would stumble because I would suddenly see a lantern post and I would try to avoid something that actually isn't there. Walls, trees, those kind of things are what I see mostly, but also have those, I call them creepy men. They're men in trench coats, a bit like they've fallen out of a 50s or 60s style movie. That's how you have to imagine them. But they seem really creepy, and I would see those. And that really took me a couple of years to realize that they aren't actually there. So if I would walk home at night and I would see them, it would make me really scared because they were sort of there and they follow, because of course my eyes were making them up. They weren't actually following me. But that really freaked me. And now, even now that I know they're not real, there are moments where I'm trying and I'm thinking, is this really not real? Is this just my CBS, or is there actually some creepy, dodgy person standing there? So yeah, once I realized, I shared with my husband. But again, some of the realization actually came through the sharing, understanding that some of this isn't just what everyone has.
I wonder if these creepy men, and I'm assuming that is what you meant when you said you started having like random or some additional kind of hallucinations.
Yeah.
I wonder if they came along when your eyesight started to diminish some more, or was it maybe brought on by life change or stress? And I know when I ask people to go back and tell me about their life or their situation, sometimes it can be hard to pinpoint, but do you think your eyesight was getting progressively worse when they started coming on, or was it maybe triggered by something else?
I do think it was that very big dip. In the middle of my PhD, I went down from quite visually impaired to register blindness. And that sort of happened over roughly a 6-7 months period that coincided also with a lot of nausea, headaches, dizziness, wobbliness, where I just felt off kilter and everything. And once that had calmed down and I was getting used to my new eyesight, that's when those things started, where I would walk somewhere and then just stop because there was suddenly a lantern post. Or I would suddenly see a hole in the floor, or, from like a construction site that had no safety things around it, or things like that. And at first I thought, this is odd. Maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks on me, which in a way it is. But I thought maybe it's my depth perception that's off. Maybe it's something else. Maybe I'm just tired. I was working full time and doing a PhD and I just lost more sight. Or maybe it's just that I'm just too tired when I'm on my way home. But slowly, as with time and over the months and years going by, I realized, no, this is really something else. It happens mostly at night or in twilight. I'm night blind, and it hardly ever happens during the day, but yeah, it does happen a lot in that sort of twilighty and complete nighttime situations. And again, then also when there are a lot of light changes between areas with lantern posts that are brighter and then the darkness in between the lantern post. But it definitely happened after that very big dip down in my eyesight.
You mentioned that it took a couple of years before you realized that the men and some of these other types of hallucinations that were different than the fireworks were not real. What are some of the things that you did within those few years that helped you get to the point where you were able to realize that the hallucinations were not real?
With the creepy man, that I would say that the creepy man was the key to unlock that for me. Because a couple of times when I would walk around and I would be with someone, I would mention that creepy person. And then they would say, there isn't actually anyone. And I was like, no, they're there. And we would actually walk really close up to the place where I saw that person. And the person would get bigger while I was walking closer and so forth. But then I could really feel there is actually no one, because at some point I would stand exactly where the person stood and there was nobody. And that really helped. And then realizing, oh, that probably means the other things are also not weird, which I knew because the Lantern Post I didn't walk in, but especially with those creepy men, I knew that probably my sense of not being safe, being a blind woman walking around on my own, probably also triggered that a bit. There's sort of some anxiety that sort of started triggering some of that. I don't know if that's true, but it was always something where I felt that is probably playing into it a bit as well. But yeah, it was really those situations where I would be with someone, my husband mostly, and I would mention it and he would say, no, there's actually nobody there. And then I would be, okay, starting to recognize which ones are the hallucinations and which ones are actually real people. It still doesn't fully work. Everything else, all the other hallucinations, it works with sort of dodgy, creepy looking people. I still sometimes don't know if they're real or not.
It's amazing because I've heard people with CBS that are married describe interacting with their spouse, and it's difficult. And it's difficult for the spouse and for the person that has CBS because they're both frustrated at each other. They're angry, and the person that has CBS is angry that the spouse is not seeing the hallucinations. And then the spouse that's trying to support the person that has CBS is frustrated that they keep saying it's hallucinations. But it's so good to hear a story like yours where you say your husband actually helped you along the way, and whether you realize it or not, you had to actually allow him to help you along the way. Can you tell me a little bit more about that process? Was he always calm in the beginning? Was he saying, no, it's not there? Was he ever yelling? Tell me a little about that process.
Throughout the entire process, he was always calm. When we met at uni, when we were both undergrad students, I was already visually impaired and I knew I had a progressive condition, a progressive degenerative condition. So I was always very upfront from the first stage, always saying, I will lose more sight. I don't know when. Without wanting to sound melodramatic, it could literally be in 5 minutes' time. I really do not know. And because it's a rare condition, even the doctors aren't 100% sure. And I always did that, as I said, on the first date or whenever I met people, because I wanted to be very clear that if this at some point is going to go any further into some long-term full-on relationship, that the other person is fully aware of what they're getting into. And if they want out, I'd rather find out day one rather than day 500. So he knew, and he was there through a couple of smaller sight losses along the way. And then while I was doing my PhD, he experienced the physical side of the sight loss when I was always feeling nauseated, dizzy. I was falling a lot. I would walk into things because I would suddenly veer off the path or would stumble. I have very wonky ankles from that period because I've fallen down so many stairs that I really don't know how many anymore. I stopped counting at some point. And he was very patient with that and understood that this was a tricky period. We had to cancel a lot of plans because of my constant headaches and migraines and everything. And then when things started calming down, he really helped. One thing where he got pushy, as did my parents, were getting me to use a long white cane. I had one, but I wasn't using it. And I still remember to this day the conversation where he was like, you carrying your white cane in your backpack isn't going to do anything. That's not how that thing works. He's like, I don't know much about it, but I know that's not how it works. Either you got to use your cane or you got to get a guide dog, but this is not safe. And it was true because I had near misses with cars a couple of times by that point. And all the falling downstairs and walking into things and so forth. But even that was just sort of sitting me down and saying very clearly, something needs to change. This isn't safe. But always in a sort of calm and supportive way. And back then we were still living in Germany. I was starting then to look for a guide dog. I ended up moving to the UK because that's where I got my first job in academia. And I ended up getting a guide dog here, which made a huge difference. But he was always very supportive, but also talking sense into me, sometimes being that mirror that goes, this ain't working. You got to change. Something needs to change. I'm really worried that the next time you near miss with the car will not be a near miss. Or the next time you fall down the stairs, you're not just spraining your ankle severely. It's going to lead to a concussion or some really major injury. And it can't go on like this.
Wow, the journey of a relationship, in your case, a marriage, and it's good to see that it's working because we help each other. And really, truthfully, our caregivers or the caregivers of people that have CBS or other conditions are usually their spouse. So it's a process and it's growth. It'd be good to even maybe speak to him one day and hear his perspective. You mentioned the physical side of blindness. Is that unique to your condition, or is that something that can accompany other conditions when people go blind?
From all the conversations I had with different visually impaired people or blind people, the experiences vary a lot, but having headaches or migraines or sort of ocular pain so that the eyes hurt or one eye hurts is something that some people experience, some very rarely and some quite frequently. And many say it's a hidden side effect of having sight loss. Another interesting thing is that many of us have other physical side effects, for instance, from walking more carefully or putting your foot down straight rather than rolling your foot. That, of course, has implications for your knees and your hips and so forth. As a guide dog user, I'm currently in between guide dogs, but as a guide dog user, your left arm is always stretched slightly forwards, which has implications for your shoulder. Many cane users also notice things with their shoulders or their wrists, or the constant stabbing yourself with your cane if you live in places that have very uneven pavements or broken pavements like I do. I think there's certain side effects that come from the mobility aids we use. Those of us who do use mobility aids, as not every blind person uses a mobility aid. And some of them are actually linked to the unique conditions. For instance, I have photophobia, which means I'm highly light sensitive. So there are days when I couldn't even open my eyes without wearing sunglasses, even indoors, because any light just feels like someone is stabbing my eyes and it hurts a lot. And there are days when I just have to sit in a completely dark room and really no light because I just can't stand any light at all. And there are lots of other eye conditions that have photophobia linked to it. So then people face the same kind of challenges with pain that comes to a light exposure.
When you were speaking and you were saying that you were apprehensive to use your white cane, at least you had it in your back pocket or you had it with you, but you were apprehensive to take it out and use it. I've heard that said by a lot of people that are visually impaired. Can you speak about maybe why you felt that way and you didn't want to use it?
I think the biggest reasons for me why I didn't want to use it looking back is to become openly disabled. Because before, while my eyesight was bad, but still good enough that I could navigate around without a white cane, there would be things when people would potentially realize that I was visually impaired. I wouldn't recognize people. I couldn't read menus or find things in the shop or stuff like that. But I could get around and I would get home and to work and so forth. I was already using assistive technology at work, but I always felt I was different because I was in my office or at home with my laptop, and that's fine. But the moment I started using the white cane, it almost felt like there was this huge neon sign above my head, like disabled, but also as a woman, easy target. Go attack her. She's easier. She can't even see you coming or something. So that was really part of it. It was this mixture between feeling much more exposed and less safe, but also knowing that any kind of stigma that is so linked to disability would then also be on me even more. And having grown up as a visually impaired child, I already had a lot of experience of discrimination, of ableism, and a lot of the challenges. So I was just really apprehensive of having even more of those challenges and facing even more of that, even when I simply was just on the way home from work or going to the shops or just going to the gym or just doing random everyday things. And it has, and it does make a difference, because before it was like you could hide in a crowd and people would just assume you were non-disabled. With a cane, people know you are disabled. And for me, even in my research, when I talk to people with different disabilities, the sort of step from having something that is more invisible to something where you have a visible marker or having a visible disability is a huge step, because everyone knows. Invisible disabilities have huge issues as well, because often people face the challenge of others just not believing them. So that's tricky on that side. And I faced that too while I was without a white cane. People sometimes just thought I was a rude teenager or a rude woman in my 20s who was just making stuff up when I said I couldn't see it. But the other thing was also, as I said, just walking around and knowing everyone around you now knows that you're blind, or at least that you're visually impaired, and knows that you're disabled. You can't hide it anymore.
So, what has been the reality? Have you faced those types of discriminations and things like that, or has it been more positive since you used the white cane?
I have to say, I've experienced very different responses between the white cane and the guide dog. With the guide dog, it's been very positive. People have been very helpful, asking if they could help, if I need anything, coming up to me, introducing themselves when I go in a shop or somewhere. With the cane, I sometimes feel like it repels people. And even if I walk with someone, they say people are actually jumping out of the way, which is good. So I have my path I can walk. But people approach me a lot less when I'm with my cane than when I'm with my dog. So in terms of getting help, I found the experience of the guide dog a lot better than with the cane. What I found more challenging with the guide dog is that I almost became the person with the dog. So even if I would go to an academic conference, talk about my research, people afterwards wouldn't ask me questions about my research. They would ask me questions about, how was your dog trained? How old is she? How long has she worked with you? What can she do? And oh, she's so cute. Oh, she was so well behaved while you gave your talk. And people were so fixated on talking about her, my dog, rather than seeing me as a professional at a professional event, which an academic conference is. So I found that very frustrating. That's different with my cane. With the cane at networking events, a lot of people don't approach you at all. You just end up standing there. But if they do, then do talk to you about your research or other, just chit chat as well. But with the dog, it was always very much focused on basically giving a talk on how guide dogs are trained, which I like doing. I do that as a volunteer for the UK Guide Dogs charity, but it's not what I want to do when I'm at academic conferences or other professional events. That's not why I'm there for. So those were the kind of differences and experiences I've had.
It's amazing that everything has a pro and con, and you have to outweigh the pros and the cons and choose what's best for you at the best time. But obviously, like your husband said, and many others say, when you need help, you got to find the best way to get that. And I'm sure you've had those, can be, in my opinion, a little bit negative, even though they didn't mean harm. It could not be a nice thing when people do that. Instead of talking to you about the research, talk to you about the dog. So I can understand the frustration. But it seems that overall, you haven't had any really bad experiences, the guide dog or the cane.
I have what is almost unfortunately considered usual experience of access refusals, where I have to have discussions. Yes, my guide dog is allowed here, or Ubers and taxis pretending you weren't at the pickup point and canceling your drive, stuff like that, which is very frustrating. I've even had airport staff threatening me with the police because they were pretending on me of trying to smuggle my dog illegally into the UK, where I always think this would be the worst plan ever, trying to get a full-on Labrador onto a plane
Yeah.
without anyone noticing. I was like, this is like the worst smuggle plan in the world, if this was actually my plan. So I had all of those experiences. What happened, what experiences I had more with my cane that were negative, that I had less so. I had them with my guide dog, but less so, where instances where people would just pull me. I would just be standing on the pavement, waiting for a friend or waiting for a car or something, or maybe sometimes just standing there trying to figure out where I want to go or so. And then people coming up to me asking if I want to cross the road, if I need help. And I would say, no, actually, I don't. I'm fine here. I'm just waiting for someone. And they're like, oh, no, it's fine, my dear, my lovely. I can help you. And I said, no, I'm fine. I really do not want to cross the road. I need to be on this side where I am, and I want to stay here. And then they just suddenly grab my arm and actually drag me across the street. And then when I say this now really wasn't helpful to me whatsoever, because now I have to cross this busy road back again because I need to be on the other side, that then people even got very rude and sort of like, oh, you could be grateful. I'm like, what? I can't be grateful. I didn't want any help. I did not want to be on this side of the road. And I told you multiple times, and then you just grabbed me and dragged me along, which is also extremely disorientating for any blind or visually impaired person. Or people trying to help me by carrying my bags. So I would suddenly be all freaked out. Where's my stuff? So some of those come from a really good place, I know, but you can't just grab a person and drag them along, even if you think you're helping them. That's just never okay.
We actually need to have more dialogue between people that have a disability and people that don't. And because, like you said, some of these people come from a really good place and they think they're trying to do what's right. But in these particular instances, it was not right or it didn't feel good to you. So hopefully people listen to this podcast and they hear some of these scenarios and say, maybe let me rethink some of the ways that I think about things or that I try to approach people, because you just aren't born knowing things. You got to hear about it, be exposed to it, and hear a different perspective. So thanks for sharing these examples, because it's really important to be able to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things I do quite a bit over here in the UK, where I go into schools and I talk to children about it. So they then educate their parents. It's always great to see when you hear a kid tell their parents off for doing something. But exactly. And in many cases, it is this. But when it comes to helping blind people, visually impaired people, it's always offering them to be guided rather than dragging them, because nobody wants to be dragged anywhere or pulled and pushed around. They even had people pushing me from behind. And I said, I can walk on my own, and you pushing me actually puts me off balance. So that isn't always really helpful. And even with CBS, talking about hallucinating, there's a lot of stigma about the word hallucinations, because people have very bad connotations about it. And you're like, no, those are just things we don't fully understand what the brain and the eyes and everything are doing. But those are hallucinations that people have, and they're okay. Once they understand, they can deal with them, or at least understand that they're not real. But even there, different things help. Like I found dealing with my random hallucinations, those creepy men and lantern posts and walls and stuff like that, a lot easier with my guide dog, because if she was happily continuing to walk, I knew she wouldn't walk me into a lantern post or a wall or towards someone that is sending off dodgy vibes. So I knew it would be okay. With my cane, I have that less. So I don't know. I just trusted less. I know it's more on me as well, but I just have less trust in me and my cane than I had in a dog. So I really can't wait for my next guide dog. But as you said, it is all about understanding that everyone's individual experiences and individual needs are so different. And in my research around disability, that's really one thing that keeps coming up again and again. Just because you met one blind person, you have no clue what the next blind person really needs, because their eye condition might be completely different. They might have been born blind, and that's a very different experiences to losing your sight as a teenager versus at 70. Also, how quickly you lost your sight, how tech savvy you are, how easily you were able to adapt or not, how your family reacted to it, if you had to change career because you had a career that just doesn't work when you can't see. You can't be a blind surgeon, at least not yet. Who knows, with AI one day you might be, who knows. But it's all of those things, understanding that we're not a homogenous group, we're a very diverse group. And that because of that, it's always better to simply ask people if they need help and then accept if they don't want help. Even if you feel they do need the help, it's also a huge step to learn to accept help. And it's a step everyone goes to at a different pace. And there are days when you find it easier to accept help. And then there are days where people just want to figure it out themselves, and it's their mission for the day. I do this without help, and this is my objective for the day. And then that's perfectly fine, and everyone should respect that too.
I like what you said about trust, because everybody is going to have to trust somebody sometimes. And sometimes if you have a disability, depending on what disability it is, you may have to trust people more than others. So by you saying that your guide dog will not walk you into a light pole, or I think we call it different things in America and in the UK, but by you saying that, that actually is important. And whether it's a spouse, a child, or a friend, saying that if there was a goat in my living room, my spouse would tell me, or if I asked, was this here? And they said no, then maybe it's not. Or if they're holding my hand at this particular moment and guiding me, if something was there, they would say something. So I think that's really important. And that's not easy when you're seeing things in the moment. But was that something that just came naturally, or did you have to develop that trust with your guide dog, or even your husband or some other people?
I mean, with the dog, with my guide dog, it came quite quickly, but it still took time. We sort of increased our level of adventure from just walking from home to campus. I can walk to my workplace, to then venturing further afield into London, and then traveling within Europe, and then even traveling all the way over to the US and Canada, and then doing more and more adventurous things within the countries as well. So she's even guided me through the Mammoth Caves in the Midwest in the US and places. So we've done a lot of stuff, and that was built, but there's certain things like certain tricky hikes. There are certain things like tricky hikes, for instance, I would almost only do with my husband or my parents, because I know that they understand what help I need, when I need it, and how I need it. And the communication is just a lot easier. So one thing is trust, but it's also, I don't have to go into a lot of explanation. Sometimes I can just stop somewhere or just do a hand gesture or so forth that will indicate, oh, I need help. But they also anticipate. They're like, okay, there's a light change here because suddenly, I don't know, there are a lot of trees and it gets darker. So when that light changes, Anica will need more help. So they already anticipate those things. So I think some of this trust really comes with times. In the first few weeks or even months of dating my now husband, I wouldn't have gone on a hike up a mountain with him. Not because he wouldn't have been able to, but because I felt There wasn't yet that full trust that we would make this work, and without me stumbling, without it being too complicated or being stuck. And also being able to, I think there's also learning to trust yourself in there a lot, understanding when do I need help, where are my boundaries, and knowing that those boundaries shift with time. Some stuff you might be able to do more with time, and some stuff you have to do less, and constantly adjusting. With a degenerative, progressive condition like I have to regularly adjust to new things. Just at the end of last year, just in the pre-Christmas period, I lost more of my depth perception. So I spent a lot of weeks knocking stuff over because I saw them not quite where they were. Now I'm fine again because I again learned to understand my new depth perception. But again, I communicated this to my husband, so he helped more, making sure that I wouldn't bump into things as much or knock things over as much while I was trying to adjust to this new way of seeing. So, and even the switch from a guide dog back to a cane, you rely much more on yourself with the cane, and then remembering how it works, trusting yourself again. So I think there's a lot of those things that come with time, where you also have to be kind to yourself and know that there are days when, no matter even how much trust you have in another person or your mobility aid or your own ability, that you might not be wanting to do something or might just not work because it's just not the day for it.
I like that. Trust yourself and be kind to yourself. So thanks for sharing that. But if we could transition for a little bit, if you can speak about your research, and I know you have done a lot of research and you do a lot of things. So wherever you would like to start, feel free to just shed some light on some of the research you're doing, especially for Charles Bonnet or the visually impaired.
Absolutely. So my research journey actually started in a very different field, in what is called social entrepreneurship, where we use the tools of starting an organization to create societal change. That's where I started with. But my passion in many ways was always around disability. But again, I had succumbed to stigma, or following a stigma, because I thought, I'm disabled myself. If I now do research on disability, is this going to almost downgrade my research? Are they all going to be like, what's the blind one going to focus on except disability and blindness? Or what else was she supposed to do? But then when I had my PhD, I was like, you know what? It is what I'm actually really interested in and where I want to make a change. So almost screw them or screw what everyone else might be thinking. I'm just going to go with this. So I changed my research focus after I started my academic career, which was a bit of a risky move. It paid out, but it was risky. And now I do a lot of research on disability in general. I call it disability inclusive organizing, where I'm trying to understand how we can create a world that is more disability inclusive, where you don't have to ask for accommodations or adjustments, where things like access refusals are something people heard of from things that happened in the olden days, where disability is nothing unusual or not seen as those who always need something else, where it's not special needs or anything, where it's just human needs, and we need to accommodate for all our diversity in bodies and minds that is out there in the human world. And to be a bit more specific, so one of the things I've looked at more recently is the experience of blind and visually impaired people in South Africa when they go to pharmacies and use pharmaceutical products. And one of the things we found is just the sheer lack of perceived and experienced privacy, because a lot of their pharmaceutical products in South Africa are still filled, put in the bottles or packets by the pharmacist, and they write on it by hand what it is and how often you have to take it and so forth. And of course, blind and visually impaired people can't read that, and there is still a challenge with this very scribbly handwriting of pharmacists for even artificial intelligence to fully read this. So people then having to ask about products and feeling that they were very exposed. So we had a lot of women, for instance, talking about that they didn't really enjoy having to ask about period-related products or conception-related products in the store with everyone around being able to listen in, or having to have pharmacists read out everything about their medication to them so they would know the information, which everyone else didn't have to go through because they could simply read it in their free time. But also the other challenge of people actually taking medication that was off, taking the wrong medication because they mixed up the bottles and there might not have been a sighted person in the household. So lots of questions around that. And now we're working with computer scientists to create sort of an app and other solutions to try and increase that. In a project here in the UK, we looked at what museums and exhibitions do to make visual art more accessible to blind and partially blind people. To showcase our research, we even ended up making our own exhibition that showcased art by blind and partially blind UK artists. And then we had different types of audio description. All the artwork was touchable, and we had Braille, and we had a whole lot of stuff happening. So that basically the exhibition was done in a way that every blind person could just wander in, and could navigate it without anyone's support, which for us is what access and inclusion really means. And there are a lot of projects like that I'm doing. We've just started a project where we're going to train visually and blind people in different parts of the UK in how to use media to increase their own well-being, but to also as a form to generate income or to join activism, and figuring out how best to do that. And in another project, we look at how disabled people in general, but we have a lot of blind and partially blind people in the study, how they engage in activism, and also which barriers they face trying to become politicians, be elected for office. Because in Europe, we only have 1% of politicians who have any kind of declared disability. And as we have 15% of the global population being disabled, that's just not good enough. So again, trying to figure out where are the challenges, what can be done, and then actually trying to implement some of those changes, testing them and seeing how it goes. So it's quite a diverse thing. I work in various different countries and really just trying to understand the lived experience of disabled people, and then how we can leverage that to create policy change on a legal governmental level, but also how we can create changes in organizations such as museums or activism support organizations, political parties, companies, nonprofits, to actually create a world that just works better for us disabled people.
You're doing so much that you sound very busy. And what I like is it's a holistic approach. And it's not just one thing. You're doing things in different areas for different things, whether it's activism or making exhibits more inclusive, creating your own exhibits, and how people can read their medications, even in other countries, South Africa, I believe that you said. So that's so important because your whole life, everything is interconnected and affected. So if you have an easier time and feel more included in this area of life, it could help in that area of life, or maybe it could even help with CBS. One thing a question that popped into my mind, I did a little research on you before our interview. And also you mentioned you lived in Germany, you lived in Canada, you visited multiple countries, you lived in the UK. Can you talk a little bit about the differences living and visiting different countries as a visually impaired person? Are some countries a little more accepting, or is it a little easier or better in certain places? Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I have lived in different parts of the world, and some of that I would say was by choice, but not by choice. So what I mean by that is I grew up in Germany, actually East Germany. So I was born on the other side of the wall. So I was born in what was then still a socialist communist country, but I was very young when the wall came down and Germany was reunited. But I was 11 years old when we finally had a diagnosis, which wasn't the right one. Back then they thought I had a Stargardt's disease, which is very similar to what I have, but different. But Germany did not have, and still doesn't fully have, an inclusive education system. So what that means was I had no legal right to go to a mainstream school. However, I was at a mainstream school at the age of 11, and with a lot of tricks and workarounds, I could make it work. But then I was diagnosed, so I got a disabled person's ID card, and then really everything changed overnight. I was suddenly very much treated differently. I was not allowed to do PE for insurance reasons, which is really something an 11-year-old understands. And all kinds of different things. But one of the things that kept happening were these so-called integration teachers, which these days we would call them special educational needs teachers or inclusive teachers, would come by and tell my teachers how horrible my eyesight was and that I would really struggle. And they would take me out of class roughly every 4 to 6 weeks, telling me that my idea of going to university and getting a degree is just not going to happen. And that I should just leave school after year 10 and then sign up for a sheltered workshop, and that something like basket weaving or broom making was the only options I had. And to be very clear, nothing against anyone in those positions, but it was not what I wanted to do. And I wanted to go to university. I was always something I wanted to do, even when I was really young. So I understood very quickly that education will be my only way forward. And I was, to this day, extremely grateful to my parents who taught me that and who understood that as well, even though they still had to deal with the changes from living a lot of their life in a socialist communist country and then suddenly being in capitalism, having to deal with that. But they understood the importance of education and the importance of the English language. So when I was 14, I went to England for just a couple of weeks on a language tour. When I was 15, I went to the US for a month to learn English. And then at 16, I went to New Zealand for a year and a half on my own without my parents. I lived in a different family while I was down there to finish basically to get my high school degree. And the reason why I did that was because I knew, because my eyesight was continuously going down, that I wouldn't be able to finish high school in Germany, not because of lack of ability, but simply because there were no accommodations. So I wouldn't even get any exam papers in large print or anything like that. So you can't really do well in an exam if you can't actually read the exam questions.
Yes.
So in New Zealand, it was such a different experience. I arrived, they knew I was visually impaired, and they asked me, what do you need? And I was like, I don't know. Or what do you mean? Actually, I said, what do you mean? And then they started listing all of these things like, yeah, you could get additional time. You could get a reader for your exam. You can dictate your exam. You can type your exam. What is it that you need? And I was so amazed. It made it possible for me to graduate from high school. I then went back to Germany for my undergrad, which worked okay because I went to a smaller university, and then I went back down under to Australia for my master's, which again was so much easier. They had people note taking for me if the lecturers would write things on the board that I just could not read, or they wouldn't say it out loud, so I wasn't even aware it was there. So, and again, I had accommodations for my exams so that I could just do them. So that's some of the big differences. When it comes to having a guide dog, again, Germany is still very tricky. There's no country that my guide dog and I have been to, and we've been to 15 different countries where we've been yelled at as much. I usually just pretend I don't speak German, so that has helped. But where you have much more access refusals. The laws are the same. But the challenge is that there's just not a lot of advocacy happening. Not a lot of people are even aware of the laws, and there's not a lot of sanctioning if the law is broken. So that makes it harder for people to obey. But yeah, there's a huge difference between countries in terms of what counts as disability, what accommodations you can get, how easy you can get them. In some places, like in Germany, you can get a lot of accommodation, but it's a lot of paperwork, very complicated paperwork that takes months, and is, even for a blind person, at least when I might have changed, this is a few years ago when I was still there, the forms you had to fill in were in font size 6. So there was no way any visually impaired or blind person could fill that in. So I had my husband fill them in for me. But it took us ages. It was such a complicated form, and it was not, and half of it we couldn't fill in because it was always assuming that I would be unemployed and have no high school degree and so forth. So there weren't even places where I could put my degrees. And so it was all very tricky, and each country has their problems, but there's definitely a lot of diversity. And UK has a lot of challenges. There's a lot of negative scapegoating of disabled people happening at the moment over here, but there's also a lot of positive and good things. But yeah, to make a long story short, I went to New Zealand because it was my way to get an education, but also my way of ensuring that I speak English, because I knew that English would open up a whole world to me, and that might be the only way I would ever get a job, by not living in the country I was born and raised in, but to be able to just move somewhere in the world wherever someone was willing to give a blind person, or a person visually impaired person and a blind person, a chance on a job.
Wow, you should write a book. That is just so amazing. And that's the short version. I know there's so many other aspects to your story, and it's just amazing. I didn't even know it's possible to go somewhere when you're underage, unless your parents signed paperwork before you left, under 18, and then to go on your own. And then they ask you, what do you want? Not your parents. What do they want for you? So that is really an amazing thing.
Yeah, no, as I said, I'm really grateful to my parents, because the reality is that my mom basically worked just to pay for my education. Like, basically her whole income went into my education, and that they worked hard. My mom went back to university to get another degree, and my parents worked a lot, very long hours, worked a lot, because they realized that they might have to support me. They only told me when I turned 30, but apparently they had like plans to set up a company if necessary that could hire me so I could work. And they were really trying to figure out how best to support me. And I know it wasn't easy for them, sending their visually impaired daughter to literally the other end of the world. And this was pre-Skype, so we could only have a 15-minute conversation once a week, which cost like $1 a minute or $2 a minute. So wow. It was hard, because there's really just somewhere else, and I had to deal with challenges on my own, because I couldn't really chat to my parents about it, because we couldn't afford those long telephone bills. And New Zealand at that time, at least the part where I lived, didn't have DSL, so you still had a modem dial-up. And I'm not talking ancient years ago, but it was in the early 2000s, but it was just a different time to now. But I'm really grateful that they, again, coming back to trust, they trusted me in being able to do this. And they knew that this would, if it works out, be life-changing. And I knew it was, because, as I said, I could finish high school, and I came back speaking English fluently, which allowed me to go into the jobs and everything, and the degrees and jobs and stuff I had since, and to really follow my dreams and my passion. Otherwise, that would not have been possible.
I hear that there's no better way to learn how to speak a language than immersing yourself inside of that environment, inside of a country that speaks that language. Is that the case for you? Was it much easier than learning in Germany in like a classroom?
Yeah, it is a ton different because one, you can't escape it. You can't simply just say the word in your own language. If you want to talk about a screwdriver and you have no idea what the English word for it is, then you just have to describe what you do with it and what it is until someone gets what you're trying to say. Yeah, and it was tricky in the beginning where I'd sit in class sometimes and things like chemistry and would be like, or economics, and think, what are they talking about?
Hmm.
Because there were all those jargons and those discipline specific terms that I just had never heard of. And but then not being able to translate after a while, you just sort of to talk and listen and do everything in that language. Yeah, it is very tiring in the beginning, but it is really the best way to learn. And then it just at some point it just really becomes second nature, and you're like, oh wow, I woke up this morning and my dreams were actually in English.
That's amazing. And even if you know how to speak English, calculus can be a hard class. Yeah, definitely, boy. So, what are some things that you are doing to cope with your Charles Bonnet syndrome? Because you said that some of your hallucinations pretty much stay with you consistently, and you're still living your life, you're still successful, you're still getting on. So, can you share some coping mechanisms or some things you've done to help you start to frame your mind to deal with this so you can cope with this condition as you navigate it?
Yeah, sometimes with the ones I always have, it's hard to explain the process, but sometimes I'm just trying to think my way around them. It's very difficult to explain how that works, and it's semi-successful. But sometimes I just turn my head or turn my eyes or sort of shift the angle my eyes are at. And sometimes that helps, even if it just gives me like half a second or a second of the glowworm or the fireworks not being right at what I'm trying to look at. But there are definitely days where they just utterly annoy me, where I just want 5 minutes without them, just 5 minutes without glowworms and constant fireworks. That would be amazing, because even my dreams now have that kind of overlay. Because I guess it's all my visual memories playing into that. With those, I would say I'm not as successful in always going around them, but I've learned to accept it. And I've also stopped trying to get rid of, for instance, my head movement. I'm like, everyone else just has to deal with the fact that I move my head more or my eyes move from left to right. Some of it they do on their own, but some of this I actively do, because it basically moves the glowworms and the fireworks into one corner just for a tiny moment. And that kind of gives me just this millisecond sometimes of relief, but it just can make all the difference in a day. With the ones that just show up randomly, I've learned to sometimes closing my eyes for a little while can help, and then opening them again. Sometimes just then using other things, like using my weight cane and not using it the usual way, but almost poking it forward, holding it horizontally forward. And then, okay, there's apparently nothing. There's no pole or post or wall, tree or something. And yeah, with a creepy person, sometimes closing my eyes for a little bit and then opening them again can help, because then it doesn't necessarily mean that the hallucination is gone, but it just can sometimes pop up in a completely different area where then I rationally know no one could have moved this fast. No one can, I don't know, cross a main street in a second and then stand there all casual. And yeah, sometimes I start talking to myself. Or when I had my dog, I started talking to my dog, which was more to deal with my nerves and see if she shows any signs, relying on her instincts. And yeah, if I'm really not sure if this is a hallucination or not, then I honestly sometimes just turn around and just take a different route home, or wait for someone else to come by and then walk past the place where I see that person, because then at least I know I'm not walking on my own. Even if it's a stranger, you can feel sometimes a bit safer when you're not the only one wandering around. So yeah, some of it works, some of it just doesn't work, and some of it works on some days and it doesn't do anything on other days. But again, I'm just trying to be patient, and I also know it's just not gonna go away. So accepting it. And sometimes I do enjoy the firework and the glowworm show. So sometimes I just sit there and enjoy. The glowworms make shapes, so they make geometrical shapes. Sometimes I just enjoy watching them make circles and then turn into triangles. And so sometimes I almost use it as a calming strategy as well.
That's good that you can find enjoyment in it sometimes and that you try different things. And it's interesting that something can work one day and it may not work another day because CBS is different for different people. So the coping mechanisms can be different too. What works great for one person may not work for another. So if
Yeah.
there's just one thing that someone can get from what you said and that can help them, is definitely worth it. Can you talk a little bit about your blog? I understand you have a blog/website, and I would like to hear about it. I'm sure the guests would too.
Absolutely. So it's called Disability Research Diary. It goes by DR for Disability Research Diary, so drdiary.blog. And I've started it because a lot of people started asking me questions about what it's like to be blind in academia. Academia is not the most inclusive place, not just in regards to disability, but also race and religion or socioeconomic background. So it has its challenges when it comes to marginalization and discrimination. So people ask me, but also sometimes wondering how I manage field work trips to Uganda and India or in South Africa and other places I go to for my research. So I started blogging about some of those experiences, highlighting, what it's like, but also things that frustrate me, such as people just talking to me about my guide dog rather than my research or me as a person. What it was like things like what it was like during COVID to do online teaching as a blind person and all kinds of things. But the website also holds links to a lot of the research articles and book chapters I've written, as well as to some of my more outreach activities. So I've made a documentary about disabled women and how disabled women activists and how they navigated the pandemic. It's a little documentary that we have on YouTube, so it has links to all of it. So I think it's a good place to find out more about my experiences, but also some of the research or the work I do with a lot of other scholars, but also disabled people's organizations and so forth.
That sounds great. And I understand you're a professor too. Can you share university you work at?
Yes, I'm at Royal Holloway University of London. So we are one of those universities that has different colleges, and mine is called Royal Holloway. It's just outside of London, the west side of London. And yeah, I became full professor in August last year, which was awesome. It was a very happy day. I literally jumped for joy. I was jumping up and down in my room when I got the call. And then ate a huge ice cream afterwards. But yeah, and I'm in the School of Business and Management. So I teach management students and do my research with lots of scholars within management, but also within psychology, geography, disability studies, humanities, and even neurologists, health economists, and all kinds of different people. So I really like to work with diverse people within the academic fields, but also outside. But yeah, if anyone ever wants to see the campus, we have a huge actual palace on our campus. And a lot of students say it looks a bit like Hogwarts. They like the Hogwarts experience. It doesn't quite look like Hogwarts, but that's what the students always see when they see this huge castle palace thing on campus.
That sounds terrific. It sounds great. And congratulations. That's exciting to become the professor. That's exciting. Yeah, at such a great university. So If there's someone that's listening to this podcast and they actually have Charles-Bonnet syndrome, you discussed a little bit about coping mechanisms, about your experience, but do you have anything else that you would say to maybe some kind of encouragement or some kind of advice or anything? Because some people actually enjoy their Charles-Bonnet, but some people it's really difficult and it's turned their life upside down. So the people that are having a particularly difficult time with the condition, do you have anything that you can maybe share with them now?
Yeah, from my own experience and from talking to various people who have CBS, I would say trying to find someone you can talk to about it, whether that's a family member, spouse, a friend, or various sort of groups that you can find online that of other people have CBS, I think is so important, because I think the hardest thing is when it's this kind of feeling alone and you think something is wrong with me. And I know that is a lot of what many people who have CBS think first when hallucinations start. This whole what's happening was wrong. And yeah, and as I said before, I still think generally being kind to yourself and saying it's okay that I find this difficult. Or as I said, I to this day don't know if the creepy people are real or not. And even if I recognize them as hallucinations, I still get my heart races, I get sweaty hands, I get all the signs of my body preparing for fight and flight, basically. I get all anxious, and but I think it's okay. It's okay that they still make me feel afraid and I still feel fear. And it might always be like that, maybe not, but I think giving it time, being able to share it with someone, and giving yourself a break and saying, you know what, maybe I can't cope with it today. Let's put a line under today and maybe we try tomorrow. And again, tomorrow doesn't work. That's fine too, because it's a journey and your hallucinations might change with time. And then again, you might have to do a reset and relearn everything. But I think giving yourself patience and the kindness and sharing it with someone, whoever that person is, if there's someone that you know or that you get to know because of CBS, I think just reduces the burden when you know you're not alone, that either someone understands because they have it themselves or they understand because they just want to be there for you. I think those would be the main things.
So you mentioned your blog. Can you leave your email address in case anyone would like to contact you?
Sure. So that is ANICA dot ZEYEN at rhul.ac.uk.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm sure the guests will appreciate that too. And once again, your blog is drdiary.blog. So that's DRDIARY.blog, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm sure they can check that out. And you probably have a link in there if anyone had a question or could contact you. I'm sure it's probably something on there too.
Absolutely.
So this is great, and I've learned some things, and it was definitely great to hear your story. And thanks for all of the research that you're doing, and thanks for just sharing your perspective. And it's always good on this podcast. I want anyone that has any knowledge or experience with CBS to be on here, but it's always a little bit more special when someone that actually has CBS can get on here and talk about their firsthand experiences. So people can learn from it. Hopefully, other people can get encouraged from it or learn how to cope better, or doctors can be more familiar with the condition. So I appreciate that. And thanks for your time and sharing all of this information.
Well, thanks for having me. It was lovely.